Town Bank Mortgage, NMLS number 512138, is an equal housing lender. This podcast is for informational purposes only. And now, the man born with a 5 o'clock shadow and with the NMLS number 2028-201. He is a gentleman. He is a scholar. He is
Tyler Cralle.
Well, I wish I had better news. I do not. It was not a good day for rates. But it could have been worse because, my God, that inflation report was pretty bad. Like across the board. There was like no saving graces in there. And then we got turmoil in Great Britain. It's causing some problems for bond yields, at least their bonds. Or gilts. Called gilts, right? But then we did actually get a good household debt report. We'll talk about that. And then we had a 10-year bond auction, which was not great, but was better than the last one, from what I can tell. So welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday edition of Wilmington Mortgage. I am the aforementioned host of this podcast, Tyler Cralle, of course, loan officer at Town Bank Mortgage, right here in Wilmington, North Carolina, where we break down the top stories impacting mortgage rates every single weekday, unless, of course, I am sick, on vacation, or at Azalea Festival. And it's neither of those. And I'm wearing a vest. If you're watching on YouTube, I keep putting the vest away, and then the temperatures drop, and I bring it back out. And so I don't think I've ever worn my vest in May. This has got to be a first, at least since vests became fashionable. I'm using that term ironically. Okay, I understand vests are not fashionable, or not Patagonia vests. The finance bro vests are not fashionable. But I got it back out, so I got a feeling this could be the last time. I highly doubt. I mean, we're almost in mid-May. What is it, the 13th? So, yeah, that is crazy. You won't see this again until probably October, if I had to guess. All right, a lot going on today. Started off with some global news. So we had a really, really bad election for the Labor Party, which the current prime minister is a member of. I think it's Keir, right? Keir Starmer? I always just see Starmer. I'm never really know how to pronounce his first name, so I'm going to go with Keir. So, the way it works with a parliamentary system is usually when you have an election for these, seats, because remember the prime minister is basically like a speaker of the House for our version, but he kind of has the power of the president for the most part. It's very different than our system where we elect the president and then you have a speaker of the House of the, Senate leader and all of that. And so when you have a really bad election, usually you can then have what they call, a confidence vote. Or is it no confidence vote? It's a confidence vote of some kind. And then, if you don't have the votes, then you're gone. They'll find somebody else. Now, a lot of times, and this has happened a lot recently in the UK, I think this is like the 4th or 5th leader in the last 4 or 5 years. It's like they're like just about almost one a year at this point. Was Truss the one who was there for 2 months or so? I mean, it's been rough. And so if the leader's like, oh man, I don't have the votes, he'll usually step aside or say he's going to step aside at some point and allow the opposition to kind of build a coalition and figure out what they're going to do. Because that's the other thing about a parliamentary system is there's 50 parties over there because they don't have single member districts like we do in the U.S., which are first past the post systems, which essentially are 50% plus one in order to win a seat. Over there, you have sort of a national vote, and then they kind of tally up the votes and figure out how many seats are going to be awarded. And so you can have, a ton of parties. But in order to actually get anything done, you have to form coalitions. And so when your coalition falls apart, then you have no power. And then a new coalition will form with new factions and everything else. And clearly it's been causing problems in the UK for a couple of years now. And it's not getting any better. And so Starmer's like, I'm not leaving. He's like Leonardo DiCaprio, Wolf of Wall Street. He's like, I'm not leaving. And he's like, I'm staying. He is calling their bluff. Because I think about 80 members of the Labor Party have said that they want him to resign. That was the last number I saw. And but they have to coalesce around someone. If no one else can get enough votes, then there's not going to be a leader. And so he's calling them their bluff and is like, we got to govern. And if you want me gone, then call a confidence vote. Otherwise, full steam ahead. And so as of right now, it does not appear as if the opposition has enough votes to formally move forward to get him out of office and then have someone to replace him. Until that happens, I guess he's just going to keep calling it. Even the people of his own party are telling him to drop out. What's funny, though, is they're like, what we want him to do is just say he's going to resign, so that will give us time to find a replacement for him. And it's like, oh. And they're like, I can't believe you won't do that for us. So we have that going on, which is causing bond yields in the UK to just jump. The 10-year is at, I think, an 18-year high. I think 08 was the last time we saw or right around there that we saw yield this high. And the 30-year is at almost a 30-year high. 98 was the last time we saw yield this high. And the reasoning is because people are under the impression, this is what happened in Japan recently when they had the new election, and it looked like that you were going to see you're going to see inflation rise. And so you're going to see bond yields rise. And so what's happening is people think that there's going to be more spending in the UK with whoever the new leader is going to, get that position by promising more spending. So that's going to cause inflation to rise, which is going to cause, bond yields to rise. So people are buying bonds. Or I should say they're not. They're selling them. So prices are falling and yields are increasing. And so that's why you're seeing yields jump, and sort of global yields are jumping. So we got this dysfunction in the UK. And then here in the United States, markets were awaiting the latest CPI report looking at the month of April, and they were not good. This was not a good report in any way, shape, or form. It was bad. I mean, it could have been worse. That's like sort of the theme of the day. It could be worse. It could have been worse. So the headline number, the month over month, all items index rose 0.6%. Now, of course, if you annualize that, that's 7.2%. That's crazy inflation. But it is down from March's 0.9% rise. So it's like, well, it could have been worse. It could have been 0.9%, almost 1%. But it's still the second largest monthly increase in more than 3 years. So even though it was better than the month before, it's still pretty awful. On a year-over-year basis, inflation is now 3.8%, up from 3.8% in March, and now the highest level since September 2023. So almost a 3-year high. What is driving this? We all know what it is. Energy costs are skyrocketing because of what is going on with Iran. Energy prices rose another 3.8%, or jumped 3.8%. That is down from the massive 10.9% rise that we saw the previous month. This pushed annual energy inflation up to almost 18%, with gasoline prices now up just over 28% year over year. So energy prices, boom, are up. But here's where it gets more problematic. Food prices also accelerating. Previous month, March, flat, no change. This month, or April, I should say, 0.5% increase. That's a 6% annualized rate. That's a problem. Annual food inflation is now 3.2%. That's the highest level since last August. Now, this is a problem because the concern, we know that, energy and oil, that's why we have a core index, because energy and food can be impacted by non kind of inflationary events. So even without an expansion of monetary policy, we could essentially have, food prices jump because of a famine, right? We could have crops get wiped out. So food, kind of a supply shock. So prices jump. Same thing with what's happening right now with energy, right? They jump. So that's why core is so important. So if you're seeing a ton of volatility with food and energy and everything else, as long as core is standing strong, then you feel like, okay, maybe this will pass. So here's kind of the problem. So core inflation also moved higher, with prices rising 0.4%, up from a 0.2% rise in March. Largest monthly increase since January 2025, excuse me. So it's been a while since we've seen that big of a jump. Annual core inflation is now at 2.8%. I think it's the highest level since, I want to say it was, August. So the concerning factor is that, and this is what we've talked about before, where Jerome Powell had mentioned, these energy shocks and how monetary policy is not necessarily able to deal with those until they possibly become entrenched in the overall economy. And so if you have all of a sudden suppliers, retailers, whatever, are paying more for product because of the higher energy costs, which are going into transportation, of moving the products to them and away from them to their buyers. So they start raising their prices to deal with those energy costs. And then now all of a sudden it's filtering through the economy. And it looks like that's what we're seeing with the higher food prices and other core products. And so it's like, that could be a problem. So it's sort of like alarm is raising, but we're not entirely there yet. Because one of the reasons why core could have jumped was shelter inflation, which was a concern. There was a piece in Barron's, I mentioned it yesterday in my morning newsletter, about the way that shelter was being calculated and the way the government shutdown could have hit it. We did see a big jump, a 0.6% rise just month over month. Biggest increase since January 24. So it's been a little while, back when things were kind of calming down. So a big jump there with regards to shelter inflation, which could have had an oversized impact because it is, I think it's like, I want to say 1/3. It's not 2/3. It might be 1/3 of core. It might be 2/3. It's a big percentage. And so a big move in shelter can have an oversized impact because of, the number one expense for most people is their rent. And that's what shelter costs are supposed to look at, rent and rent equivalent. And so to see a jump like that can have a very big impact. So it was not a good report, is what I'm saying. And there's concern that we're seeing some of the energy shock maybe filter its way through the economy and some other prices. That could be a problem. That could force the Fed to have to deal with the situation, which means rising rates. And so, like I said, it was not a good report in any way, shape, or form. Anyone saying otherwise is lying. It was not a good, could have been worse. But it was, that's the thing that's kind of amazing, is that as bad as the increase in energy prices is, it's not as bad as like Europe and other places. So it's like, it's bad, but it's not as bad as it could be. So those are the two kind of big stories I think that were really moving markets. And I don't know, did I say what rates were doing? So the 10-year was up about 5 basis points. So we're now at 4.46%. That is the highest level since July of last year. And then Mortgage News Daily, their 30-year fixed rate index, had rates jumping. I think yesterday they jumped 7 basis points again. We're now at 6.56%, according to, once again, Mortgage News Daily. So kind of a rough day for rates. But then later in the day, we got a Treasury auction. And it's so funny is they have a Treasury auction like every 2 months, something like that. For their whatever, for a 10 years, what I'm looking at, because the 10-year obviously has an impact on the mortgage rates. And it was not a great auction. But what's funny is every time there's a Treasury auction, I always have to go back and be like, okay, what again was the, what's a direct bidder again? What's the primary deal? So I always go back and I'm always like, I'm going to remember this time. And then I always go back and have to look at it. But here's the takeaway. So we did see a kind of soft, weak bid to cover. And basically what the bid to cover is, it's, it sounds interesting. But basically it's, you have primary dealers, which are banks and other institutions that are designated by the Fed to be kind of the other side of a transaction, and they'll buy up treasuries if there isn't a demand for them in the market in order so prices don't collapse. Direct bidders are institutional investors like pension funds and big institutions, and then indirect bidders are kind of everyone else like foreign central banks, individuals, just sort of people that don't fall into the first two categories. It really is what it is, and so you look at sort of what the demand is versus what is actually being issued. And what you want is there to be much more demand than are actually being issued. There are 42 billion being issued in this auction. And so what you want is a pretty big demand. And it was weak. The bid to cover was 2.4, which is below, I think, the average of, I think, like 2.5. And the higher number, the better. So lower number, you don't want that. And so it was a little weak, but I was looking at the last auction, which is kind of crazy because this auction, 4.468 is what the yield was, versus back in February, it was 4.17. I was like, oh, I missed the 4.17 days. But what I did notice was direct and indirect bids were actually up this time. And direct bidders were actually up almost like 2%. And the indirect bidders were kind of right where they were, which is always good. You don't want to see a huge increase in the primary dealer because they're like sort of the last, line. They have to buy them if you're seeing weak demand in the other categories. And so it was not a great auction in comparison to sort of the average, but it was actually better than the last one. I think the last auction, the bid to cover was like 2.39. So we actually improved slightly from the February auction. So it was weak, but a little better than last time. So I'm going to say all in all, it wasn't that bad. Just like before. Could have been worse. That's the theme of the day. Could have been worse. Should I call that the name of the podcast today? Could have been worse. And then we got from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, we got household debt. I know I'm going over. I usually try and keep it 15 minutes. Today, I think we're going to go 20, just because this is such a good report. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York Center for Microeconomic Data released its quarterly report on household debt and credit. And the report showed that total household debt in the first quarter of 2016 rose by just 0.1%. So it went from 18. Yeah, it now stands at 18.8 trillion. I mean, it's like, that's a rounding error. 0.1%, that's a rounding error. Mortgage balances grew by 21 billion in the first quarter and now total 13.19 trillion at the end of March, which if you do the math on that, that's a 70.1% of all debt is mortgages. An increase in mortgage debt is looked at as kind of a good thing in the economy. Home equity lines of credit balances rose by 12 billion. Not a huge number there. Nothing too scary. So home equity lines of credit rose by 12 billion, totaling 446 billion, 129 billion above the low reached in quarter one of 2022. So what they're pointing out is we're up from the lows, but we're nowhere near the craziness of 2008, which is why when people make those comparisons, they're just bad. Here's more good data. Credit card balances fell by 25 billion, standing at 1.25 trillion. Now, I get it in the grand scheme of things, 1 trillion, 25 billion, like rounding error. But the fact that we're seeing a decrease in credit cards at a time where we're hearing about economic uncertainty, people living paycheck to paycheck, what's happening is people are paying off their credit cards. They're getting ready for maybe a rainy day. So they're making sure they don't have these, large debt payments. So that's a good sign. That's a sign of a good consumer. A lot of auto loan balances increased by 18 billion to 1.69 trillion, while student loan balances remained essentially flat, decreasing 6 billion at 1.66 trillion. The pace of mortgage originations was largely steady, 530 billion in the first quarter of 2026. Aggregate limits on credit cards continue to rise with a $60 billion uptick, which is pretty amazing. Because think about that. So people's balances are decreasing while their credit lines are increasing. So credit card companies are saying, hey, you can spend more if you want. People are going, no, I'm good. I'm actually going to drop it. I'm actually going to pay some off. And so, once again, that is a good sign for the American consumer. All this concern about the American consumer sentiment, everything else, true, sentiment might be down. Maybe that's why people are paying off their credit cards. But that's a good report. So on a day of, could have been worse, we did get a good report. I think that was a good report by all metrics. So let's close out there. We'll end with a win. All right, what do we got happening today? We got more inflation data, PPI coming out 8:30. Then we got a 30-year bond auction. So more inflation data. Yay. All right, we're going to go. You guys enjoy your Wednesday. We'll be back here Thursday for another edition of Wilmington Mortgage. And remember, as always, do not wait to buy real estate. You buy real estate and you wait.